Jake Morrison had been walking through the thick forests of Kepler 442b for 3 days now, and his legs were starting to hurt, but he kept moving because the signal on his scanner was getting stronger with each step he took, and that meant he was close to something valuable, or at least he hoped it was valuable, because 3 days of walking through alien forests, eating nothing but protein bars, was not his idea of a good time. But such was the life of a salvage hunter in the Outer Rim colonies, where every crash site and every piece of abandoned tech could mean the difference between eating well for a month or going hungry. The trees on this planet were massive things with trunks as wide as small houses, and their leaves were a strange violet color that made everything look like he was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. And the moss that covered the ground glowed faintly in the shadows, which was pretty, but also made it hard to see where he was stepping, and he had already twisted his ankle twice since landing here 3 days ago. Jake pushed through another curtain of hanging vines and stopped dead in his tracks because there it was. And the ship was unlike anything he had ever seen in his 15 years of salvage work, and he had seen a lot of ships in that time, from human vessels to alien craft from a dozen different species. But this one was different in a way that made his skin prickle with unease because it looked half alive with curves that seemed more organic than mechanical, and sections that pulsed with a faint blue light even though the ship was clearly crashed and damaged beyond any hope of flying again. He approached slowly with his scanner held out in front of him like a shield, and the device was going crazy with readings that made no sense because the energy signature was too high for a dead ship and too rhythmic for a standard power core, and it almost looked like a heartbeat on his display, which was impossible because ships did not have heartbeats no matter what species built them. The hull was cracked open near what he assumed was the front, and Jake climbed through, carefully testing each handhold before putting his weight on it, because the last thing he needed was to fall and break his leg out here where the nearest human settlement was 3 days away by foot, and that was assuming he could even walk with a broken leg, which he probably could not. Inside the ship was dark except for those pulsing blue lights, and the air smelled strange, like ozone, mixed with something floral that he could not identify, and his boots crunched on broken crystals that covered the floor, and he wondered what they were for because they seemed too delicate to be structural. Then he saw her, and Jake froze because he had not expected to find anyone alive in a wreck this old, and the scanner had said the crash happened at least a week ago. But there she was, lying against the far wall of what might have been a control room or maybe a living quarters, and it was hard to tell with alien ships. She was humanoid, which meant she had 2 arms and 2 legs and a head in roughly the right places. But that was where the similarity to humans ended because her skin had a faint glow to it, like she had swallowed starlight, and her eyes, when they opened, were the color of deep space, all purple and black with flecks of silver that moved like distant stars. Jake knelt down beside her and pulled out his med scanner, because even if she was alien, she was clearly hurt, and he had not spent 5 years in the colonial marines just to let someone die in front of him without at least trying to help. She wore what looked like a suit that covered her from neck to toe, and the material was strange because it seemed to shift colors as he looked at it, going from blue to silver to something almost transparent and back again, and there were cracks in it that leaked a silvery fluid that might have been blood or coolant or something else entirely. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, and her eyes locked onto his, and she spoke in perfect English, even though her lips barely moved, and Jake wondered how that was possible, but filed the question away for later because she was clearly trying to tell him something important. "Please," she said, and her voice was soft but desperate, like someone begging for their life, and Jake had heard that tone before in the war, and it never meant anything good, and she continued talking even as he tried to gently pull his hand back so he could scan her properly. "You must not remove the suit," she said, and her grip tightened on his wrist until it almost hurt, and Jake stopped trying to pull away because clearly this was important to her for reasons he did not yet understand. "I am not going to hurt you," he said slowly and clearly because he did not know if she could actually understand him, or if she was just repeating phrases she had learned, and he continued speaking in what he hoped was a calm voice, because the last thing he needed was for her to panic and hurt herself for him. "My name is Jake," he said, and he pointed to himself when he said his name, hoping that would help her understand. And then he pointed to her with his free hand and waited to see if she would give him her name in return. "Lisa," she whispered, and her grip on his wrist loosened slightly, and Jake took that as a good sign, and he slowly pulled his hand back, and she let him go this time, and he brought up his med scanner again but kept it where she could see it so she would know what he was doing. "What happened here?" he asked as he started scanning her. And the readings were bizarre because her body temperature was way too high for a human, but the scanner was not registering it as a fever. And her heart rate, or what he assumed was her heart rate, was too slow, and there were energy readings coming from inside her body that made no sense at all. "My ship," she said, and paused to take a breath that sounded painful, and Jake winced in sympathy because he knew what broken ribs felt like. And she probably had a few based on how she was breathing, and she continued after a moment. "We were running," she said, and her eyes closed briefly like she was remembering something terrible. And when they opened again, they were bright with what might have been tears. Except the liquid that leaked from them was silver, like the fluid leaking from her suit. "They are coming," she finished, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine because he knew what those words meant. And he had heard them before from refugees fleeing the collective, and from colonists who had seen their homes burned, and from soldiers who had watched their friends die, and it never meant anything good. Jake worked quickly to set up his portable habitat because the temperature outside was dropping fast as the twin suns of Kepler 442b started to set, and he had learned the hard way that nights on this planet got cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under an hour, and he was not about to let either of them die from something as stupid as hypothermia after surviving whatever had crashed Lisa's ship. The habitat generator hummed to life and spread out like a mechanical flower, creating walls of hardened foam that would keep the heat in and the cold out, and within 10 minutes they had a space about 4 meters across with a ceiling high enough that Jake could stand up straight, and he helped Lisa move inside because she was clearly in pain even though she tried to hide it. She watched him with those strange star-filled eyes as he unpacked his emergency supplies and laid them out in neat rows on the floor, because organization was important when you were 3 days from help and had limited resources, and he had protein, bars and water purification tablets, and a basic medical kit that was designed for humans but might work on her depending on her biology. "You need medical attention," he said as he opened the medical kit and pulled out the scanner attachment that would give him more detailed readings than the handheld unit, and he moved toward her slowly so she could see what he was doing. "That suit is damaged, and I need to assess your injuries properly." He continued and reached out to touch the cracks in the silvery material, but stopped when Lisa flinched away from him, like he had tried to hit her instead of help her. "No," she said, and her voice was sharp with fear and maybe anger, and Jake pulled his hand back immediately, because he was not going to force anything on someone who clearly did not want it, and he had seen enough battlefield medics get punched by panicking soldiers to know that you did not touch someone without permission, even if you were trying to help. "The suit is not clothing," she said after a moment, and her voice was calmer now, like she was trying to explain something complicated to a child. And Jake sat back on his heels and waited for her to continue because clearly there was more to this than he understood. "It is a containment system," she said, and gestured weakly at the damaged sections, where the silvery fluid continued to leak out slowly, and Jake noticed that the fluid seemed to evaporate after a few seconds, leaving no trace behind, which was odd. "If you breach it completely, you will doom us both." She finished and looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, because her face was similar to human faces but different enough that he could not be sure if she was scared or angry or something else entirely. Jake leaned back against the wall of the habitat and studied her carefully, because in his years of salvage work, he had learned to trust his instincts about people, and right now his instincts were telling him that she was being honest, and that whatever she was afraid of was real and dangerous. "Explain it to me," he said quietly, and he kept his hands where she could see them because he wanted her to know he was not a threat, and Lisa seemed to relax slightly at his tone. She closed her eyes for a moment like she was gathering her strength, and when she opened them again they seemed to glow a little brighter in the dim light of the habitat, and she started speaking in a voice that was soft but steady. "My people are called the Luminari," she said, and the name sounded beautiful in her accent, and Jake filed it away in his memory, because he had never heard of the Luminary before, and he prided himself on knowing most of the major species in this part of the galaxy. "We evolved on a world bathed in intense radiation," she continued, and Jake felt his eyebrows rise because that was not something he had expected to hear. And she kept talking before he could ask questions. "Our bodies generate and process energy in ways that would be lethal to most organic life," she said, and gestured at her suit again. And this time Jake understood why she had been so desperate to stop him from removing it. "This suit does not just protect me," she said, and paused to take a breath that sounded painful. and Jake wanted to give her something for the pain, but he did not know if human painkillers would work on her, or if they would kill her, so he stayed still and let her finish. "It protects everything around me," she said, and the fear in her voice was clear now, and Jake felt his stomach drop because he was starting to understand just how dangerous the situation might be. "These breaches are small enough that the safety protocols can contain the leakage," she said, and pointed to the cracks in her suit where the silvery fluid continued to seep out, and Jake noticed that his scanner was showing higher radiation readings near those cracks, but nothing dangerous yet. "But if you were to remove the suit entirely trying to help me," she said, and trailed off, but Jake understood what she was not saying, because he had worked around reactors before, and he knew what happened when containment failed. He pulled out his scanner and ran a deeper analysis of the energy readings coming from her suit, and what he saw made his blood run cold because the levels were insane, and he was looking at enough contained energy to power a small city for a year or level 1 in a matter of seconds if it was released all at once. "How much energy are we talking about?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer would be bad, and Lisa looked at him with those cosmic eyes and said something that made him wish he had never found her ship. "Enough to sterilize everything within. 5 kilometers, she said, and Jake felt his mouth go dry because 5 kilometers was a long way, and that would include the forest and the mountains and probably the colonial settlement that was 3 days' walk from here. He sat back and ran his hands through his hair, which was getting long and needed cutting. But that seemed like a stupid thing to think about when he was sitting next to a living bomb that could go off if he made one wrong move. "Okay," he said finally, because what else could he say, and he looked at the damaged suit, and then at Lisa, and then back at his medical supplies, which suddenly seemed completely inadequate for the situation. "Okay," he said again, and this time he was talking more to himself than to her. And he started thinking through the problem like they had taught him in the Marines, because every problem had a solution. You just had to find it. "Can the suit repair itself?" he asked, and Lisa nodded slowly and pointed to one of the smaller cracks where he could see thin filaments growing across the gap, like threads being woven by invisible hands. "Yes," she said, "but it needs time and energy, and I am running low on both," she added, and Jake could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "How long do you have?" he asked, and Lisa was quiet for a moment, like she was doing calculations in her head. "Maybe 2 days," she said finally, and Jake nodded because 2 days was something he could work with, and he started making plans. Night fell on Kepler 442b, like a curtain dropping, and the temperature plummeted so fast that Jake could see his breath misting in the air inside the habitat, even though the heaters were running at full power, and he sat near the entrance watching. His perimeter sensors, because Lisa had said they were coming and he believed her. He did not have to wait long because just after midnight his alarm started screaming, and Jake jumped to his feet, grabbing his salvage rifle from where it leaned against the wall, and he checked the display on his wrist computer, and what he saw made his stomach clench with fear. 3 ships were dropping through the atmosphere, and they were big military-grade vessels with the kind of firepower that could level a small city, and they were heading straight for his position, like they knew exactly where to find him and Lisa. "They found me," Lisa whispered from behind him, and Jake turned to see her struggling to sit up, and her face was tight with pain and fear, and he wanted to tell her to stay down, but he knew it would not matter if those ships decided to just blow them off the map. The ships landed in a perfect triangle formation around his habitat, cutting off every possible escape route, and Jake recognized the tactic because he had used it himself back in the Marines when they needed to trap someone who might run. "The collective," she said, and Jake heard real terror in her voice for the first time since he had found her, and he moved to stand between her and the entrance, like his body would make any difference against military-grade weapons. "Why are they hunting you?" he asked, even though he was already checking his rifle and making sure it was loaded, because whatever the answer was, he had already decided he was not going to just hand her over to people who made her that scared. "Because of what we are," Lisa said, and her voice was barely a whisper, and Jake glanced back at her and saw that her suit was glowing brighter now, like her fear, or maybe her anger, was making the energy inside her harder to contain. "Because of our power," she continued, and Jake turned his attention back to the ships because the doors were opening, and figures in heavy combat armor were emerging, and they moved with the kind of precision that spoke of serious training and experience. "The collective believes we are too dangerous to exist," she said, And Jake heard the bitterness in her voice, and he understood it because he had heard the same arguments used against other species, and sometimes against humans too, when people decided that fear was more important than compassion. They have systematically destroyed our worlds, our ships, everyone they can find, she finished, and Jake felt anger burn hot in his chest, because he knew what genocide looked like, and he had fought against it before in the war, and he had sworn he would never stand by and let it happen again if he could do anything to stop it. A voice boomed through external speakers, and it was loud enough that Jake felt it vibrate in his chest, and the voice was cold and mechanical, like whoever was speaking did not think of them as people, just as problems to be solved. Surrender the Luminari, and you will be permitted to leave, the voice said. And Jake almost laughed because he had heard that lie before, and he knew exactly what permitted to leave meant when you were dealing with people who committed genocide for a living. Interfere and you will be eliminated along with it. The voice continued, and Jake noticed the use of it instead of her, and that told him everything he needed to know about how the collective saw Lisa and her people. He looked at Lisa and then back at the approaching soldiers, and every rational part of his brain was screaming at him to comply, because he was one man with a salvage rifle that was designed for scaring off scavengers and wildlife, not for fighting trained soldiers in military-grade armor. But Jake had also spent 5 years fighting in the Outer Colonies War, and he had seen what happened to people who trusted the promises of those who came with guns and genocide in their hearts. And he had made a promise to himself after the war that he would never be that person who stood by and did nothing. He activated his shelter's defense shields, which were designed to protect against environmental hazards like radiation and extreme temperatures, not military-grade plasma weapons, but it would buy them a few minutes at least. And he turned to Lisa with what he hoped was a confident smile, even though he felt terrified. I'm going to need you to trust me, he said. And Lisa looked at him with those cosmic eyes, and he saw something in them that might have been hope, or maybe just desperation. But either way, she nodded. The soldiers opened fire, and the world exploded into light and heat and noise, and Jake felt the habitat shake as plasma bolts hammered against his shields, and he watched the power gauge dropping fast, and he knew they had maybe 5 minutes before the shields failed, and then they would be completely exposed. There is a cave system half a kilometer north, he said, as he pulled up the topographical map on his wrist computer, and he had scouted it the day before when he was tracking the energy signature, and it had seemed like a good place to hide if he needed to. Deep enough to hide thermal signatures, he continued, and he was already gathering his essential supplies and stuffing them into his pack because they were going to have to move fast. I cannot run, Lisa said, and she gestured at her damaged suit, and Jake could see that the repairs had stopped and some of the cracks were actually getting bigger and leaking more of that silvery fluid. The containment is failing, she said, and her voice was calm, but Jake could hear the fear underneath it, and she continued talking, even as another barrage of plasma fire hit the shields. Every movement risks a breach. She finished, and Jake understood what she was saying, but he also knew that staying here meant certain death for both of them. He made a decision and grabbed his emergency patch kit, which was designed for repairing hull breaches on ships, and it was not meant for what he was about to do, but it was all he had. Tell me what to do, he said as he knelt beside her and opened the kit, and Lisa's eyes went wide with surprise or maybe fear. You would risk, she started to say, but Jake interrupted her because they did not have time for this conversation. Just tell me how to stabilize it, he said, and kept his voice firm because he needed her to focus, and Lisa seemed to understand because she started giving him instructions in a voice that was urgent but clear. The polymer patches need to bond with the organic components, she said, and Jake pulled out the synthetic patches and peeled off the backing, and Lisa guided his hands to the worst breaches. Press firmly for 10 seconds, she said, and Jake did exactly as she instructed, even though his hands were shaking, because one wrong move could kill them both. The patches bonded with the suit material, and Jake watched as the silvery fluid stopped leaking, and the cracks seemed to stabilize, and it was not a perfect repair, but it would have to do. The shields failed with a sound like breaking glass, and Jake knew they were out of time, and he scooped Lisa into his arms, and she weighed almost nothing, like she was made of light instead of flesh and bone. He ran. Jake burst through the habitat's rear emergency exit, just as the soldiers poured through the front, and he could hear them shouting behind him. But he did not stop or look back, because looking back would cost him precious seconds that he did not have. The forest was dark except for the violet glow of the moss, and Jake thanked whatever gods might be listening that he had his military-grade vision implants, because without them, he would have been running blind and probably would have broken his neck on the first fallen log. Lisa was light in his arms, but his shoulder was already starting to ache from the awkward angle, and his lungs were burning because he had not run this hard since his last deployment, and that had been 3 years ago, and he was out of practice. Behind them he could hear the soldiers crashing through the undergrowth, and they were not being quiet about it, because they did not need to be when they had numbers and weapons and armor on their side. "Why are you doing this?" Lisa asked, and her voice was quiet against his ear, and Jake almost stumbled because he had not expected her to speak, and he focused on not tripping over the massive tree roots that crisscrossed the forest floor. "You do not know me," she continued, and Jake could hear confusion in her voice mixed with something that might have been gratitude, and he jumped over a fallen log without breaking stride. "You do not owe me anything," she finished, and Jake wanted to answer, but he was breathing too hard to waste air on talking, so he just kept running. A plasma bolt hit the tree next to his head, and the bark exploded into splinters, and Jake felt some of them cut his face, but he ignored the pain and changed direction, putting the massive trunk between him and the soldiers. His lungs were screaming for air, and his legs felt like they were made of lead, but he could see the cave entrance ahead, and it was just a dark mouth in the hillside, but it looked like salvation, and he pushed himself harder. Jake dove into the cave just as another volley of plasma fire tore through the space where he had been standing, and he rolled as he hit the ground trying to protect Lisa from the impact, and they ended up in a tangle of limbs against the cave wall. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath and trying to remember how to make his body move. And Lisa was still in his arms, and he could feel her heart beating fast against his chest, or maybe that was his own heart, he could not tell. The cave was deep and dark, and Jake forced himself to stand even though every muscle in his body was protesting, and he picked Lisa up again and moved deeper into the tunnel, because the entrance would not hide them for long. The cave system was bigger than he remembered from his brief scouting trip, and the tunnels branched off in multiple directions, and Jake took the largest passage because it looked like it went the deepest, and right now, deep was what they needed. He could hear the soldiers at the cave entrance behind them, and they were arguing about whether to follow, and Jake hoped they would decide it was too dangerous because he did not know if he could keep running. His legs were shaking, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges, and he knew he was running on adrenaline and stubbornness, and neither of those things would last forever. Finally, he found a chamber that was far enough from the entrance that he felt safe stopping, and he set Lisa down as gently as he could, and then collapsed beside her, because his body simply refused to move anymore. "The patches are holding Lisa," said after a moment, and Jake could hear the surprise in her voice, like she had not expected his improvised repairs to work. And honestly, he had not been sure they would either. "You did well," she continued, and Jake wanted to laugh because well seemed like an understatement when they were still alive, but he was too tired to do more than nod. "How long?" he asked when he finally had enough breath to speak, and Lisa examined her suit, carefully running her hands over the patches he had applied. "Hours," she said, and paused, and Jake could tell she was trying to decide whether to be honest or optimistic, and he appreciated it when she chose honesty. "Maybe a day," she finished, and Jake nodded because a day was better than nothing, and it gave them time to figure out what to do next. Time for what he asked, and Lisa was quiet for a long moment, and Jake turned his head to look at her, and in the darkness of the cave, her suit glowed faintly like a dying star. She started to speak, and her voice was soft but steady, and Jake listened as she told him things that made him understand just how much danger they were really in. "My people did not evolve naturally," she said, and Jake felt his eyebrows rise because that was not what he had expected to hear, and Lisa continued before he could ask questions. "We were created," she said, and the word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications, and Jake thought about all the stories he had heard about created species and how most of them did not end well. An experiment by an ancient race that wanted to harness stellar energy in biological form. She continued, and Jake tried to imagine what kind of civilization would even attempt something like that and came up empty. "They succeeded too well," she said, and there was bitterness in her voice, and Jake understood it, because he knew how people reacted when their experiments became more than they bargained for. "We became conscious, self-aware," she said, and Jake could hear the pride in her voice mixed with sadness. And he knew what was coming next, because he had heard similar stories before. When we refused to be weapons, they tried to destroy us, she said, and her hands clenched into fists, and Jake saw her suit flare brighter for a moment before she got it under control. We escaped scattered across the galaxy, she continued, and Jake tried to imagine what that must have been like, running and hiding for generations, always afraid that someone would find you and finish what your creators had started. For thousands of years we have hidden, helped where we could, tried to prove we deserved to exist, she said. And Jake heard the exhaustion in her voice, not physical exhaustion, but the kind that came from fighting a battle that never seemed to end. But the collective sees only the danger we represent. She finished, and Jake knew exactly what she meant, because he had seen the same thing happen to other species when fear became more important than understanding. One luminary, if their containment failed completely, could release enough energy to sterilize a planet, she said. And Jake felt his blood run cold because he had suspected it was bad, but not that bad. And your suit, he started to say. But Lisa interrupted him with a sad smile. Is the only thing preventing that, she said, and touched the glowing fabric gently like it was precious, and Jake supposed it was when it was the only thing standing between civilization and catastrophe. Yes, she finished, and looked at him with those cosmic eyes, and Jake saw resignation there, like she had accepted that this was how her story would end. So you see why I begged you not to remove it, she said, and her voice was gentle, like she was explaining something to a child. And Jake understood now why she had been so desperate. Not out of modesty or fear for myself, she continued, and Jake nodded because he understood. But fear for you, she said, and gestured at him, and then at the cave around them. And Jake knew she meant fear for everyone on this planet, and maybe beyond. For everyone, she finished, and they sat in silence for a moment, and Jake thought about everything she had told him. Is there a way to fix it properly? He asked finally, because he refused to believe that they had come this far just to give up, and Lisa looked at him with surprise. To repair the containment, he continued, and he could see hope starting to kindle in her eyes, and it made him more determined to find a solution. There is, she said slowly, like she was afraid to believe it, and Jake leaned forward, waiting for her to continue. Ship's core, she said, and Jake remembered the strange sphere he had seen in the wreckage and how it had been glowing with contained power. It is damaged, but might still have enough power to regenerate the suit completely. She continued, and Jake could hear the hope in her voice getting stronger. But it is back there in the wreckage, she said, and her hope faded as quickly as it had appeared, and Jake understood why, because the wreckage was exactly where the collective soldiers were. And the collective, Jake said, finishing her thought, and Lisa nodded. We'll be tearing it apart looking for you, she said, and they both fell silent because the problem seemed insurmountable. Jake sat there in the darkness thinking, and his mind was working through the tactical situation like they had taught him in the Marines, and after a few minutes, he started to smile. Lucky for you, he said. And Lisa looked at him with confusion, and Jake's smile got wider. I am really good at getting into places I am not supposed to be, he finished, and Lisa's eyes went wide as she understood what he was suggesting. Jake spent the next hour studying the tactical display on his wrist computer, and the collective had set up a perimeter around Lisa's crashed ship, but they had made mistakes, and Jake had spent enough time fighting to know how to exploit those mistakes. They were looking outward, expecting threats from the forest, because they probably thought Lisa was still running or hiding somewhere far away, and they did not expect someone to be stupid enough to go back toward them instead of away. I am going back, Jake said finally, and Lisa turned to look at him with an expression that was hard to read in the dim glow of her suit. You stay here, stay quiet. He continued and checked his rifle even though he knew it was loaded, because checking your weapons was the kind of habit that kept you alive. If I am not back in 3 hours, he started to say. But Lisa interrupted him with a voice that was calm and matter-of-fact. If you are not back in 3 hours, I will be dead anyway, she said. And Jake wanted to argue, but he knew she was right because the patches he had applied were temporary at best. The patches are degrading faster than I expected. She continued and touched one of them gently, and Jake could see that the edges were already starting to peel away from her suit. Jake, you need to understand what you are walking into, she said, and her voice was urgent, like she needed him to really hear what she was saying. If they capture you, they will not just kill you. she continued, and Jake nodded because he already knew that. They will interrogate you, find out about this location, she finished, and Jake understood the implication that his capture would mean her death too. Then I won't get captured, he said, and tried to sound more confident than he felt, and he stood up and checked his gear one more time. Lisa gave him detailed directions to where the core was located in her ship, and she drew diagrams on the cave floor with a piece of stone, and Jake memorized every detail because his life and hers depended on him getting this right. He left the cave as quietly as possible and moved through the forest like a ghost, using every trick he had learned during 5 years of combat, and the violet moss actually helped because it provided enough light to see by without needing to use his flashlight. The crashed ship loomed in the distance, and Jake could see the collective soldiers swarming over it like ants on a corpse, and they had set up portable lights that turned the crash site into a stage, and Jake was glad because the bright lights would ruin their night vision and make it harder for them to see into the darker areas beyond. He circled around to the eastern approach where the terrain was rockiest, and his scanner showed fewer soldiers on that side, probably because the rocks made it harder to set up equipment, and people always chose convenience over security when they thought they were safe. Jake found a position behind a boulder about 50 meters from the ship, and he settled in to watch and wait, because patience was just as important as speed when you were infiltrating an enemy position. He counted 12 soldiers visible, but there were probably more inside the ship, and he watched their patrol patterns, looking for gaps in their coverage. Because every system had weaknesses, you just had to find them. The soldiers were good, but they were also bored, and Jake could tell by the way they moved that they had been searching for hours without finding anything, and boredom made people sloppy. There was a gap in the patrol rotation on the eastern side, where 2 routes met, and for about 45 seconds every 10 minutes there was a blind spot where no one was looking, and 45 seconds was not much time, but Jake had worked with less. He waited for the next gap and then moved quickly but quietly across the open ground, and he reached the ship's hull and pressed himself flat against it and held his breath, waiting to see if anyone had spotted him. No alarms, no shouts, just the sound of soldiers talking and equipment humming, and Jake let out his breath slowly and moved along the hull toward the breach that Lisa had told him about. The breach was low on the ship's eastern side, half hidden by debris, and Jake had to squeeze through, but he made it inside and found himself in a dark corridor that smelled of ozone and that floral scent he remembered from before. He could hear soldiers deeper in the ship cutting through bulkheads with industrial torches, and Jake moved in the opposite direction, following Lisa's directions toward the core chamber. The ship's interior was beautiful even in its destruction, with flowing organic architecture that seemed to pulse with residual energy. And Jake found himself wondering what it had looked like when it was whole and functioning. He navigated through collapsed corridors and had to climb over debris in places, but Lisa's directions were perfect, and he found the core chamber exactly where she said it would be. The door was damaged and partially open, and Jake squeezed through into a circular room that took his breath away because the walls were covered in crystalline structures that still glowed faintly, and in the center was the core. It was a sphere, about the size of his head, held in a crystalline matrix that looked like frozen lightning, and inside the sphere was light so bright, Jake had to look away, but not before he saw that the matrix was cracked. He pulled out the insulating foam from his pack and carefully began wrapping the core and the matrix together, because Lisa had warned him that separating them could cause the core to become unstable. His hands were shaking as he worked because he was very aware that one wrong move could release enough energy to vaporize him, and probably a good chunk of the ship, and he forced himself to breathe slowly and stay focused. The core came free from its housing with a sound like breaking glass, and Jake winced, but nothing exploded. So he kept moving and got the core secured in his pack with extra padding around it. "Intruder in the core chamber," someone shouted, and Jake spun around to see a soldier standing in the doorway with his weapon raised. Jake did not think he just moved, and his rifle came up and fired in one smooth motion that was pure muscle memory from the war, and the soldier went down. Alarms started blaring, and Jake knew he was out of time, and he ran back the way he had come. But there were soldiers everywhere now, and they were all converging on his position. He fired as he ran, taking down another soldier who appeared around a corner, and then another who tried to block his path, and his rifle was not designed for combat, but at close range it did not matter. Jake burst out of the hull breach, and plasma fire immediately lit up the night around him, and he ran for the tree line, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. Something hit his left shoulder and spun him around, and he hit the ground hard, and the core flew from his pack and rolled away from him. Pain exploded through his shoulder, and Jake looked down to see that his jacket was burned through and the skin underneath was charred and blistered, and he knew that was a plasma burn, and he was lucky it had not taken his arm off. He crawled toward the core because without it Lisa would die, and he refused to let that happen after coming this far. Boots thundered behind him, and Jake knew he was not going to make it, and a soldier loomed over him with his weapon raised, and Jake thought about Lisa waiting in the cave and about how he had promised to come back. Then the forest erupted in light so bright that Jake had to close his eyes, and even through his eyelids he could see it, and he heard soldiers shouting and the sound of weapons fire. He forced his eyes open and saw Lisa standing at the tree line, and her suit was blazing like she had swallowed a star, and Jake realized she was burning through her containment, deliberately using herself as a weapon. The soldiers fell back, shielding their eyes, and their weapons seemed to dissolve in the light she was radiating, and Jake understood what she was doing and why. She was saving him, but it was killing her. Jake watched in horror as Lisa advanced toward the soldiers, and her suit was disintegrating with each step, and fragments were falling away like burning leaves, and he could see her skin glowing brighter underneath, and he knew she was literally burning herself up to save him. Lisa, no, he shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of energy that surrounded her, and the soldiers were trying to fire, but their plasma bolts just dissolved in the field of radiation she was generating. She was magnificent and terrible-like, a walking star, and the light coming from her was so bright that Jake could barely look at her, and he knew that if she kept this up for much longer, there would be nothing left of her containment, and then everyone would die. He forced himself to move even though his shoulder was screaming in pain, and he crawled toward the core, which had rolled to a stop about 3 meters away, and it felt like 3 kilometers. His left arm was useless, and every movement sent waves of agony through his body, but he kept going because Lisa was dying to buy him time, and he was not going to waste it. The soldiers were trying to regroup, but Lisa was not giving them a chance, and she moved between them and Jake, cutting off their line of fire. And Jake realized she was protecting him, even as she was killing herself. His hand closed around the core, and it was warm to the touch, almost hot, and Jake could feel it vibrating like it was alive, and he clutched it to his chest with his good arm. He stood up even though his legs did not want to support him, and he staggered toward Lisa, and the heat coming from her was intense, like standing too close to a furnace. But he kept moving. "Lisa," he shouted, and this time she heard him, and turned to look at him, and her eyes were like looking into the heart of a sun, and Jake had to squint against the brightness. "The core," he shouted, and held it up so she could see it, and for a moment Lisa just stared at him like she could not understand what he was saying. Then comprehension dawned in those burning eyes, and Jake saw hope there mixed with the pain, and she understood what he was trying to do. She moved toward him, and the soldiers tried to stop her, but she just swept them aside with a wave of her hand that sent them flying, and Jake wondered how much power she had inside her, and how close she was to losing control completely. With the last of her strength, she dampened her radiation output, and Jake felt the heat decrease enough that he could get close without his skin blistering, and he ran the last few steps toward her. Jake slammed the core against her chest where her suit had burned away almost completely, and for a moment nothing happened, and Jake thought he had been too late. Then the core flared to life, and energy poured from it into Lisa's damaged suit, and Jake could see the material regenerating, spreading out from where the core touched her skin, like ice freezing across water. Lisa gasped and fell to her knees, and Jake went down with her, still holding the core against her chest because he did not know if letting go would stop the process. The suit was rebuilding itself, and Jake watched in amazement as the fragments that had fallen away turned to dust and new material grew to replace them, and the cracks and holes sealed themselves with threads of light. Lisa's skin stopped glowing, and her eyes dimmed back to their normal cosmic appearance, and Jake could see her breathing easier as the containment re-established itself. The core's energy flowed into the suit for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and finally the regeneration was complete, and Lisa's suit looked whole again, though it was a different color now, more silver than blue. She looked up at Jake with tears streaming down her face, and she opened her mouth to say something, but before she could speak, the sky tore open. Jake looked up and saw 3 ships descending through the atmosphere, but these were not collective. vessels, and they moved with a grace that made the military ships look clumsy by comparison. The ships were beautiful, crafted from the same organic technology as Lisa's suit, and they seemed to flow through the air rather than fight against it, and Jake knew immediately that these were luminary ships. They opened fire without warning, and their weapons were nothing like human or collective technology, and instead of plasma bolts, they fired beams of pure light that struck the collective vessels with surgical precision. The collective ships tried to return fire, but their weapon systems were already disabled, and Jake watched as the luminary ships landed in a defensive formation around him and Lisa. Figures emerged from the ships, and Jake counted 9 of them, and they all wore suits similar to Lisa's but in different colors ranging from deep blue to bright gold, and they moved with purpose toward the collective soldiers. The collective soldiers tried to fight, but it was over in seconds, and the luminary disarmed them with efficiency that spoke of long practice. And Jake noticed they were careful not to kill anyone, just incapacitate. One of the luminary approached, and her suit was the deep blue of ocean depths, and she knelt beside Lisa and placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that seemed both gentle and familiar. "Lisa," the woman said, and her voice was warm with relief and concern, and Jake could hear the history between them in just that one word. "We received your distress call." The woman continued and helped Lisa to her feet, with an ease that suggested she was stronger than she looked. "We came as fast as we could." She finished, and then her attention turned to Jake, and he felt like he was being examined by something far older and wiser than himself. "And this is the human who protected you?" the woman asked, and Jake noticed she said, "Human, not creature or it," and he appreciated that more than he could say. "His name is Jake Morrison," Lisa said, and her voice was still weak but growing stronger with each word, and she leaned on the other woman for support. "He is the reason I am alive." Lisa continued and looked at Jake with an expression that made him feel uncomfortable because he did not think he had done anything special. The blue-suited woman extended her hand to Jake in a very human gesture, and Jake shifted the cord to his injured arm, ignoring the pain, and shook her hand with his good one. "Then Jake Morrison is a friend to the luminary," she said, and her grip was firm but gentle, and Jake felt calluses on her palm that spoke of hard work and fighting. "We do not forget our debts," she continued, and released his hand and gestured to the other luminary, who were securing the area. "My name is Amy," she said, and Jake nodded in acknowledgement because he did not trust his voice right then. Over the next hour, the luminary worked with quiet efficiency, and they treated Jake's shoulder with technology that looked like magic and felt like cool water flowing over the burn. The pain faded to a dull ache, and when Jake looked at his shoulder, the burn was already starting to heal, and he knew it would leave a scar, but he had plenty of those already. They secured the collective soldiers and left them with their disabled ships, and Amy explained that it was a message, not mercy. "Let them report back," she said, and her voice was hard in a way that reminded Jake of combat veterans he had known, and he understood that Amy had seen and done things that had shaped her. "Let them tell their leaders that the luminary are not helpless. Pray," she continued, and looked at the soldiers with an expression that was not quite pity, but something close, "that we have allies now." She finished and looked at Jake when she said allies, and he realized she meant him. The collective vessels would be operational again in a few hours, but by then the luminary would be long gone, and Jake wondered if the collective would chase them or if this would make them think twice. As the twin suns rose over Kepler 442b, painting the violet forest gold and orange, Jake found himself standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the light spread across the landscape. Lisa approached quietly and stood beside him, and her suit no longer glowed, but Jake could still feel the warmth radiating from her like standing near a heater. "I owe you my life," she said, and her voice was soft but intense, and Jake shrugged his good shoulder because he did not know what else to do. "You saved mine right back," he said, and remembered the way she had burned herself to protect him, and he continued speaking before she could argue. "I would say we are even," he finished, and Lisa smiled, and it transformed her face, making her look younger and less burdened. "Will you come with us?" she asked, and Jake had been expecting the question, but he still did not have a good answer ready. "We could use someone like you," she continued, and gestured at the other luminary who were preparing their ships for departure. "Someone who sees beyond what someone is to who they are." She finished, and Jake understood what she meant because he knew that most people would have run or turned her over to the collective. Jake thought about his life before this, and it seemed small and lonely in comparison to what Lisa was offering, and he thought about returning to his salvage runs and empty planets. Then he looked at Lisa, and at the Luminari preparing their ships, and at the strange and wonderful galaxy that he had only glimpsed. "Yeah," he said finally, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not known he was carrying. "I think I will." He finished, and Lisa's smile got brighter, and for a moment her suit glowed just a little brighter, reflecting the joy within. The Luminary ship that Amy assigned to Jake was unlike anything he had ever flown, and calling it a ship seemed inadequate because it felt more alive than mechanical, and the controls responded to his thoughts as much as his touch. Lisa sat in the navigator's seat beside him, and she was teaching him the basics of Luminary technology, and Jake felt like a child learning to walk because everything he knew about ships and flight seemed useless here. "The hull is grown, not built," Lisa explained, and she ran her hand along the wall, and Jake saw the material ripple under her touch like the surface of water. "It responds to Luminary energy signatures, but it can be attuned to other species with time," she continued, and Jake wondered what it would be like to fly a ship that was partly alive. They were traveling in formation with the other Luminary vessels, and Amy's ship led the way, and Jake watched on his displays as they jumped through hyperspace corridors that human technology had not even mapped yet. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, and Lisa smiled like she had been waiting for him to ask that question. "Sanctuary," she said, and the way she said it made it sound like more than just a place, and Jake leaned forward in his seat with interest. "After we escaped our creators, we scattered across the galaxy," she explained, and Jake remembered her telling him this back in the cave, but now there was less pain in her voice. "But we always maintained contact hidden networks of communication that the collective never found," she continued, and Jake thought about what it must have been like to live in hiding for thousands of years. "Sanctuary is where we gather, where we are safe," she said, and her voice held hope and longing, and Jake understood that she was going home. The jump through hyperspace took 6 hours, and Jake spent the time learning everything he could about Luminary culture and history and technology. And Lisa was a patient teacher even when he asked stupid questions. He learned that the Luminary had no concept of ownership in the human sense because they believed that all things were connected and temporary, and that hoarding resources was a form of sickness. He learned that they reproduced slowly and deliberately because creating new life was considered the most serious responsibility anyone could undertake, and new Luminary were raised by the entire community, not just their parents. He learned that they had helped countless other species over the millennia, always in secret, always careful not to reveal themselves because the collective had spies everywhere. "Why help at all?" Jake asked when Lisa told him about a colony the Luminary had saved from a plague by leaving medical supplies anonymously. "Why risk exposure?" She continued his thought, and Lisa looked at him with those cosmic eyes, and Jake saw sadness there, because if we do not help when we can, then what is the point of existing? She said, and her voice was quiet, but firm, and Jake understood that this was fundamental to who the Luminary were. "Our creators wanted to make weapons," she continued, and touched her suit gently, and Jake knew she was thinking about the power contained within. "We chose to be healers instead." She finished, and Jake felt something shift in his chest because he realized he had found people who shared his values, even if they were not human. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and Jake's breath caught in his throat because spread out before them was Sanctuary, and it was beautiful beyond anything he had imagined. It was not a planet, but a massive structure built in the space between stars, and it looked like a flower made of light with petals that spiraled outward in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Each petal was kilometers long and covered in structures that seemed to grow organically from the surface, and Jake could see other ships moving between them, like insects pollinating a cosmic garden. "Thousands of Luminary live here," Lisa said, and Jake could hear the pride in her voice, and she pointed to different sections as they approached. "That section is our medical facilities," she said, indicating a petal that glowed soft green, and Jake saw ships coming and going constantly. "That one is research and development," she continued, pointing to a blue petal that crackled with energy, and Jake wondered what kind of technology beings like the Luminary would consider worth researching. "And that one is where I live," she finished. pointing to a golden petal that seemed to pulse with warmth, and Jake felt nervous suddenly because he was about to meet more luminari than just the ones from the rescue team. They docked in a bay that adjusted itself to fit their ship, and Jake followed Lisa out onto a platform that overlooked a vast interior space filled with light and movement. Luminari moved through the space in all directions, and Jake realized there was no up or down here, and some of them were walking on what he thought was the ceiling, and others seemed to be floating. Lisa saw his confusion and laughed, and it was the first time Jake had heard her laugh, and it sounded like music. "We do not use gravity the same way you do," she explained and touched a control on her suit, and suddenly Jake felt himself lift off the platform. He flailed for a moment in panic, but Lisa caught his hand and steadied him, and she showed him how to move by thinking about direction rather than pushing with his legs. It took Jake a few minutes to get the hang of it, but soon he was moving through. The space with Lisa and other luminari were watching him with curiosity, and Jake felt like an exhibit in a zoo. They stopped at a large gathering space where hundreds of luminari were assembled, and Jake realized this was some kind of meeting or ceremony, and Amy was standing at the center speaking to the crowd. She was telling them about Lisa's rescue and about the collective attack and about how a human had helped one of their own without asking for anything in return. Jake felt his face heat up with embarrassment because he did not think he deserved this kind of attention, and he had just done what anyone should do. But the luminari clearly did not see it that way, because when Amy pointed him out, the entire crowd turned to look at him, and their suits all brightened at once in what Lisa explained was their version of applause. A figure pushed through the crowd, and Jake saw it was an older luminari, if such a thing could be determined by appearance, and his suit was silver with threads of gold running through it. "Jake Morrison," the old luminari said, and his voice was deep and resonant and carried authority that made Jake want to stand at attention. "I am Elder Marcus," he continued, and Jake noticed he used a human name and wondered if that was for his benefit. "The luminari owe you a debt that cannot easily be repaid," Elder Marcus said, and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and Jake felt warmth spread from the contact. "But we would like to try," he continued, and gestured to the assembled crowd, and Jake had no idea what he was talking about. "We would like to offer you a place among us," Elder Marcus said, and the crowd of luminari brightened again, and Jake felt overwhelmed. "Not as a guest, but as one of us," he continued, and Jake's mind was reeling because he did not understand what that meant. Lisa stepped forward and took Jake's other hand, and she looked at him with an expression that was both hopeful and nervous. "They are offering to make you part of the luminary," she explained, and Jake's eyes went wide because that seemed impossible. "Not biologically, of course," she continued, and smiled at his expression, "but culturally, legally. You would have all the rights and responsibilities of any luminari," she said, and squeezed his hand gently, and Jake tried to process what this meant. "You would have a home here," she continued, and Jake heard the unspoken question in her words. Jake looked around at the assembled luminari, and at the beautiful structure they had built, and at Lisa, who was watching him with those cosmic eyes. He thought about his old life salvaging wrecks on lonely planets and eating protein bars and sleeping in a one-man shelter. He thought about having friends and purpose and being part of something bigger than himself. "Yes," he said, and his voice came out stronger than he expected, and Lisa's smile could have lit up the entire station. "Yes," he said again, and this time he was talking to all of them, and the luminari brightened so much that Jake had to close his eyes against the light. When he opened them again, Elder Marcus was smiling, and he pressed something into Jake's palm, and Jake looked down to see a small crystal that pulsed with light. "This will attune you to our systems," Elder Marcus explained, and Jake closed his fingers around the crystal and felt it warm against his skin. "Welcome home, Jake Morrison," Elder Marcus said, and the way he said it made Jake's throat tight with emotion. "Welcome home," he said again, and the assembled luminari echoed the words until they filled the space like a song, and Jake felt tears on his face, but he did not care. He was home. Jake had been living on Sanctuary for 3 months, and every day brought new wonders and challenges, and he was still adjusting to being part of a community that thought so differently from humans. But he was learning. The crystal Elder Marcus had given him had attuned him to the station's systems, and now doors opened for him automatically, and he could access information just by thinking about it, and sometimes he could even understand what other luminari were feeling through some kind of empathic connection that Lisa said would grow stronger with time. He spent his days learning everything he could about luminary technology and culture and history, and his nights were spent with Lisa, who had become more than just a friend, and Jake found himself falling for her in ways he had not expected. She felt it too. He could tell by the way her suit brightened when she saw him, and by the way she found excuses to touch his hand or shoulder, and one night under the artificial stars that the luminary had created in the residential section, she had kissed him. It was different from kissing a human because her lips were warmer and tasted like starlight if starlight had a taste. But it was also wonderful, and Jake had kissed her back with all the emotion he had been holding inside. They had not talked about what it meant, and Jake was not sure if luminari even had concepts like dating or relationships in the human sense, but he knew that what they had was real and important. Amy had taken Jake under her wing and was teaching him combat techniques that the luminari used, and Jake was surprised to learn that despite being pacifists by philosophy, the luminari were deadly when they needed to be. You cannot help others if you cannot protect yourself, Amy explained as she demonstrated a move that sent Jake sprawling across the training mat, and he groaned and picked himself up. And you cannot protect others if you are dead, she continued and helped him to his feet with a smile that was both kind and fierce. Jake learned to fight in ways that used his smaller size and lower mass to his advantage, and Amy taught him how to use his salvage rifle in combination with luminari energy shields, and after 3 months he was good enough that Amy said he could join the rescue teams. The rescue teams were groups of luminari who went out into the galaxy to help other luminari who were in trouble or to assist other species who needed aid, and Jake had been wanting to join them since he arrived. His first mission came on a cold morning, if morning had any meaning on a space station, and Amy briefed the team, which consisted of Jake and Lisa and 3 other luminari named Peter and Sarah and Daniel. We have received a distress call from a colony ship that is caught in a gravity well. Amy explained and showed them the coordinates on a holographic display, and Jake recognized the sector as being deep in collective space. The ship is carrying refugees from the war in the outer colonies, Amy continued, and Jake felt his chest tighten because he had fought in that war, and he knew what those people had been through. They have maybe 6 hours before the gravity well pulls them into the star, Amy said, and her voice was grim, and Jake knew that 6 hours was not much time. The collective is probably monitoring the area, Peter said, and he was the oldest of the group. Besides Amy, and his suit was a deep red that reminded Jake of rust. They will expect us to help. They are counting on it, Sarah added, and her suit was bright yellow and she had a habit of moving her hands when she talked, and Jake had learned this meant she was anxious. Then we do not disappoint them, Amy said, and her voice was firm, and Jake saw the other luminaries straighten their spines, and he felt pride at being part of this team. They took 2 ships and Jake flew with Lisa, while Amy led the others, and they jumped through hyperspace using routes that Lisa said were hidden from collective scanners. The colony ship appeared on their sensors before they even dropped out of hyperspace, and Jake could see it was in bad shape with hull breaches and failing power systems, and it was slowly spiraling toward the star. How many people, Lisa asked as she pulled up the ship's registry, and Jake saw her eyes widen at the number. 4,000, she said, and Jake felt his stomach drop because that was a lot of people to evacuate in 6 hours. They can't all fit in our ships, Jake said, and Lisa nodded, but her expression was determined. We don't need to evacuate them, she explained, and Jake looked at her with confusion, and she continued explaining before he could ask. We just need to get them out of the gravity well, she said, and pulled up a diagram that showed the physics of the situation, and Jake started to understand. If we can push them far enough, they can restart their engines and jump to safety. She finished, and Jake nodded, but he knew it would not be that simple. The collective ships appeared just as they were attaching tow cables to the colony ship, and there were 5 of them, and they spread out to surround the rescue operation. This is Collective Captain Harris, a voice boomed over the communication channel, and Jake recognized the cold mechanical tone of someone who saw people as problems. You are ordered to cease your rescue operation and surrender immediately, Harris continued, and Jake saw Amy's ship moving to intercept the nearest collective vessel. We are authorized to use deadly force. Harris finished, and Jake knew he meant it because the collective did not make idle threats. Acknowledged, Amy's voice came over the channel, and Jake could hear the steel in her tone, and she continued speaking, with a calm that made him think of the eye of a hurricane. We will not cease our rescue operation. Amy said, and Jake heard the luminary ships powering up their weapons systems, and he did the same. And if you use deadly force, you will find we are prepared to defend ourselves. Amy finished, and Jake felt his heart pounding because this was it and they were going to fight. The collective ships opened fire and the battle began. And Jake discovered that flying a luminary ship in combat was both terrifying and exhilarating, because the vessel responded to his thoughts faster than any human ship could. He dodged plasma, fire, and returned it with the luminary energy weapons that punched through shields like they were paper, and he worked with Lisa, who was coordinating their movements with the other luminary ships. The colony ship was massive, and moving it out of the gravity well required all of their combined strength. But they were doing it, and Jake could see on his displays that the ship was slowly climbing away from the star. One of the collective ships broke through their defensive line and headed straight for the colony ship, and Jake knew that if it opened fire on the defenseless vessel, thousands of people would die. He did not think, he just acted and pushed his ship to maximum acceleration and placed himself between the collective vessel and the colony ship, and he opened fire with everything he had. The collective ship returned fire, and Jake felt his shields buckle under the assault, but he held position because there were 4,000 people behind him who were counting on him to protect them. Lisa was screaming his name over the communication channel, but Jake ignored her, because he was focused on keeping the collective ship's attention on him and away from the refugees. Then Amy's ship appeared beside him, and together they drove the collective vessel back, and Jake felt his shields fail, but by then it did not matter because the colony ship was free of the gravity well. The colony ship's engines flared to life and it jumped to hyperspace, and Jake felt relief flood through him, because they had done it, and 4,000 people were safe. The collective ships retreated when they realized the colony ship was gone, and Amy ordered the luminary ships to fall back, because there was no point in continuing the fight. They returned to Sanctuary, and Jake was exhausted but happy, and when they docked, Lisa grabbed him and kissed him hard enough that he forgot to breathe. "Do not ever do that again," she said when she finally pulled back, and Jake could see tears on her face, and he wiped them away gently. "I had to," he said, and Lisa nodded because she understood even if she did not like it. "I know," she said, and kissed him again, more gently this time, and Jake held her close and felt grateful to be alive. Elder Marcus called them to the council chamber after they had rested, and Jake stood with his team while the elder spoke. "You saved 4,000 lives today," Marcus said, and his voice was warm with pride, and Jake felt embarrassed by the praise. "And you showed the collective that we will not stand by while innocent people die." Marcus continued, and the assembled luminari brightened in approval. "Jake Morrison, you have proven yourself worthy of the trust we placed in you," Marcus said, and Jake felt his chest swell with emotion. "You are truly one of us now." Marcus finished, and the luminary in the chamber brightened so much that Jake had to squint. Lisa took his hand and squeezed it, and Jake squeezed back because he did not trust his voice, and he looked around at the faces of the people who had become his family. He thought about the day he had found Lisa in that crashed ship and how she had begged him not to remove her suit, and how that moment had changed everything. He thought about the choice he had made to help a stranger, and how that choice had led him here to this moment surrounded by people who cared about him, and who he cared about in return. He thought about the future, and all the people they would help and all the adventures they would have, and he felt excited in a way he had not felt in years. Jake looked at Lisa and saw his own feelings reflected in her cosmic eyes, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. "Thank you," he said finally, and his voice was rough with emotion, and he was speaking to all of them.